Good morning. It is my great pleasure to introduce Steve Rabin, who will be my guest today. He's an attorney and an investor in small, innovative companies and lives in New York. And I would like to ask Steve to say a little bit more about you, about your career, about your experience before we go into the questions.
Sure. Thanks, Vlodak. Good to see you. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm an attorney. I've also been on the faculty at Harvard and at Columbia in their schools of public health. I have over multiple decades worked with the National Institutes of Health on disease prevention programs, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control on prevention and education programs. I've served as a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry, helping them with FDA approvals of medicine, helping them with safety controversies, also working on device approvals and creating access to medicine programs. And as you mentioned, now my focus is as an investor in the health sector, and I invest broadly, both in services and in new technologies. And I'm not really an expert in any particular therapeutic category. Instead, my focus is more general economic trends, and I'm very interested in public policy because, of course, public policy in the U.S. is globally really shapes the investment environment, and I look for political change as risk and political change as opportunity. I might say one more caveat maybe for today's conversation. You're taping this, and when your conference attendees are watching this, things may have changed dramatically as things are happening very quickly here in the U.S. So anything can change before you see this interview. So um, let me just maybe segue from there about the pace of change in the U.S. It's a radically different policy making environment. I think in my career, and I think industry has gotten very used to a relatively stable system of decision making around health policy, health expenditures, and also regulatory approvals. And that is very, very different in the first, you know, several months of the new administration. Um, Historically, you would see major changes being discussed at length through the legislative process and through a deliberative rulemaking. And here, currently, the executive branch has taken it upon itself to do very quick decision making without consultation. Um, and they're not only doing policy decisions very quickly, but also staffing decisions and removing people or dismissing people that they feel are not aligned with their agenda. And that's also something we've not seen before, where regulators that industries worked with over many years who have substantive knowledge of particular therapeutic categories or clinical trial design, they're being dismissed because they feel the current administration is concerned they're not promoters of where they'd like to take the country. Um, I think also it's hard to know. This administration is extremely adept and at communications, and they're very focused on messaging. Their staffing decisions are often selected by people who can communicate well with the public, are not traditional policymakers or academics, but people who come from the world of television or online commentary. And it's hard to tell how many of these executive orders and announcements are for messaging and public relations and political purposes, and how many of them are actually about substantive change. And sometimes they're just testing the waters. They'll put something out to see what happens. And that's a style I think that, you know, folks concerned about tariffs and other issues have gotten familiar with. But I think the same is happening in the health policy arena, where they're putting out lots of ideas. And it's hard to know which ones they will try to keep working on. And to a certain extent, if they get pushback or they get lose popular support for an idea, they might dismiss the idea very quickly. But I would say that the thing that is most I think difficult for investors and also for practitioners is the pace of change. It's a pace we've never seen in this country, at least in my multiple decades of working on these issues. How fast things are changing, and that makes it very interesting, but somewhat treacherous.
Thank you because for the introduction and setting the stage for for our discussion and the changes in the U.S. healthcare policy environment. Uh, my question to you would be, what are the main influences and which organizations, which groups influence, the policy making in health? U.S. healthcare system has huge impact, on the global healthcare systems, in different regions, different countries. So if you can maybe say a few words about it, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, this current administration came into office with a promise of making America first, and we don't know exactly how that's going to affect health policy, but you can see themes in some of the early ideas and some of the proposals that are, you know, to a certain extent, anti-European, where the EU was seen as an ally or at least a friendly competitor, but we were working together towards the same goal. I think was the ideology or the philosophy of the U.S. government towards the European pharmaceutical industry. Now, I think
President Trump, I think, said once, if I heard it correctly, that European Union was created to, damage the United States. Huh?
yes. So I think he said that. I think there's many other, certainly the US approach to NATO in the war in Ukraine is another example where the US really feels it wants to go its own way, does not feel at all beholden to former allies. And I think, that obviously has significant implications for the European pharmaceutical industry. The other thing is a great skepticism of science and industry, and this was very much, I think, born during the COVID pandemic, where a lot of the current administration supporters resisted their loss of freedom in terms of they didn't like to be told to wear a mask, they didn't like to be told to take a vaccine, and the fear of vaccine in particular, I think, created a very powerful anti-science constituency, afraid of industry, not trusting industry. And a lot of the people involved in that movement have moved into government. And I think certainly our health secretary, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., has spent a large part of his career with great skepticism about the pharmaceutical industry, vaccines in particular. Um, he has his own sources for science that are non-traditional and is willing to set policy on them. And there's a political component to his influence. He ran for president, and he had in the polls anywhere from 2 to 5% popular support. He endorsed President Trump, and President Trump won by about 2%. So I think it's fair to say that the administration sees Kennedy and his constituency as a very important part of their coalition, possibly a winning part of the coalition. He brought a lot of young people who share his skepticism of industry and elites. And so I think that I can't overstate that skepticism of science and industry is a big driver in how this administration seems to be acting. They also, rather than reaching into the scientific community for expertise and leadership, have gone to social media and conservative television influencers. And many of them are promoters of alternative remedies. Our new head of the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, Dr. Ahmed Oz, has promoted alternative therapies without traditional science behind them. So that's very different. And again, an example of someone chosen for their television notoriety and their communication skills, not necessarily someone for their known for their science experience or academic experience.
How do you, Steve, how do you see the influencing US innovation in medicine? US is the leading, still is the leading, source of the innovation in medicine.
Mhm, mhm.
Majority of pharmaceutical are created, in the US or by the US companies. So how do you see it now under new administration? Is it going to change or is it going to continue? Is it going to be boosted? What what is your view on that?
Yes. Well, certainly, following on this anti-expert bias in this administration, they don't seem to value the R&D and the innovative history of the scientific community. They have cut budgets for the National Science Foundation, for example, has had their budget cut in half from 2 billion to 1 billion, so a 50% drop. They have also obviously used scientific funding as a political weapon in their disputes with Harvard over campus policies and around protests. The majority of the money frozen and grants suspended have been medical research grants. So even though, for example, Harvard has $500 million in their R&D grants currently suspended, and there are other universities who've also been a target of the administration, they're comfortable using R&D funding as a political tool as opposed to considering it something that you shouldn't be messing with. The thing I was just recently at a breakfast with the chief investment officer for Bank of America, and we were talking about these issues, and we're talking about the tariffs and the policy confusion and lots. It's a time of immense change in the states. And he said the number one thing that worries him is the cutbacks in R&D funding, and he thinks that is the greatest threat to U.S. long-term economic interests. And I have to say I would agree. Um, of course, there's an opportunity there. I think that you're seeing the French, I think, have put together a 100 million euro fund to attract U.S. scientists. And I would expect other countries and other universities and industry around the world looking at this saying, this is an opportunity to attract talent. I
And,
think there'll be.
and exactly a lot of, a lot. I hear that more and more European scientists who went to the US to work,
Mhm, mhm.
in different scientific projects, now they seriously consider, returning back to Europe, huh?
Yes, yes, I think that that's a serious concern. There's some belief that these suspension of grants with universities are just short-lived, or it's a small percentage, but it sends, I think, a message to foreign students and to researchers saying, is this really a stable place that I want to, you know, have my career, or am I better off in some other place where my work is respected and is not used as either a political tool or attacked with suspicion? It's oddly, it's very much a cultural revolution in this country. If you think about, in China, they went after academics as suspect, and a lot of the language in this country now is shockingly similar,
Similar.
where people with any type of scientific or academic background are seen as suspect, as opposed to important assets to the country. And that's a very, very, very different country.
Yeah. How do you, what changes do you see in healthcare service delivery
Mhm.
in the US, under current administration? And then we can talk also about the dynamic with the industry in the EU, because it's interesting to see whether, there are, implications of the US situations on the European markets. And if you can elaborate, if you can say a few
Sure.
words.
Yeah, maybe I'll start with where I think the regulatory policy might impact innovation and also talk about healthcare services. But I think obviously vaccines are a top focus for the current health secretary. And I think mRNA based technology is seen with great suspicion. Um, there's also a report, Make America Healthy Again. MAHA is the name of the secretary's movement, which has got an interesting focus, a good focus on chronic disease, particularly in children. They're also focused within that, though, on over medication of children with antidepressants, antibiotics, stimulants, even asthma medicines. So I would expect new approvals for any type of pediatric indication to be very difficult. I don't think devices will have the same scrutiny. So if I were, you know, looking at where are there any bright spots here, I'd say devices probably not. Um, and I think alternative medicines that are promoted by average citizens and favored by many of the new officials will face much less scrutiny in the past. So I think you'll see a lot more remedies being promoted for disease that normally would not have gotten attention or support from the government. Now, the one thing I would say is, you know, this is some of this is shocking. It's designed to shock, and then you're trying to figure out, well, what's really happening here. The administration has an anti-industry rhetoric, but at the same time, they very much look at the U.S. stock market, and and you've seen them on the tariffs, for example, where they came out very strongly, but then they saw the impact to the stock market. And I think there will be a debate or a moderation of some of these if they really end up hurting the US pharmaceutical industry. I think you'll see the administration pull back from some of the more aggressive ideas. Going to healthcare delivery, uh, right now, as we speak, the House of Representatives has passed a new budget. In the new budget, there's a 2.5% increase for reimbursement to
Oh.
physicians. And so that's certainly welcomed by the medical community. The reimbursements have been somewhat stagnant for physicians. And the other thing that's interesting now is about half of physicians in this country now work for a large corporation or system. So one of the changes, not having to do necessarily with the administration, it's just an important trend in healthcare service delivery. It's becoming more concentrated, and our tradition of the small medical practice is very much disappearing. One of the policy issues right now in healthcare service delivery is the proposed cut to Medicaid. Again, the House of Representatives has approved this. The Senate would have to agree, and that's expected. Their decision probably you'll see in July of this summer. But right now, the House proposal is to cut $100 billion a year from Medicaid, and it's estimated that 8 to 13 million people will lose healthcare coverage. So I think you'll see a slowing in the growth of the market a bit for RX, for therapeutics, and for devices. I think private hospital systems and insurers with large Medicaid populations are going to have financial problems. But I still think the impact of that will be modest against the size of the U.S. healthcare industry. I think the U.S. will still be the largest market for the biopharm industry.
How do you see the dynamic with the industry, pharmaceutical industry in the EU? Do you think that EU is going to play bigger role now and with the US
Yeah,
going into the price cut approach? And we will talk about it, I hope, a little bit.
yeah. So the administration has said they want to see the prices for U.S. pharmaceuticals at the same price that the industry charges in Europe, and anywhere ex-U.S. They want parity pricing. And
In the lowest, even they say in the lowest price in the
yes, yeah.
European.
So I think this is one of those public relations statements,
Uh-huh.
because I think implementing that is so complicated, particularly against the U.S. pharmaceutical industry stock prices. Now, would they come up with some scheme that would hurt European pharmaceutical companies and not US pharmaceutical companies around pricing? Possibly. And they've certainly suggested they want to use tariffs on pharmaceuticals and devices. And I think that that is a real threat. Even the device industry in the U.S. right now is experiencing problems with the tariffs because so many of the components into their devices are coming from outside the U.S. So I don't know how you get pricing down for U.S. industry and European industry at the same time, but I would keep an eye on them trying their best to help U.S. industry and hurt European industry. I think, again, going back to something we've already discussed, Europe is now seen as a competitor, not and one that must be stopped. And also, I think there's a cultural dynamic to that, where the administration culturally admires power, and again, this anti-elite. And I think Europe is seen, the administration has spoken of Europe as weak, and that's something that suggests if they sense weakness, they will exploit it. And also culturally, it's seen maybe more elite than the U.S. It's people who might look down on the U.S. I don't knowing you and knowing many Europeans, I've never sensed that, but I know that some Americans who don't travel much think that the Europeans must look down on us, maybe for good reason. But anyway, for those who do, but yeah, I do think there is a cultural divide behind some of these economic and business decisions that can't be avoided.
Uh, Okay, so our time is closing. The gap is closing. So I have last one question to summarize. And you mentioned a lot of changes, a lot of trends, a lot of influences on the current, policy making and healthcare systems. What does all this mean for an investor like you?
Well, it's a great question, very complicated to sort this out. I would say the first big one is the tariffs, and because tariffs really affect component, cost of goods in anything I'm looking at, particularly device and for pharmaceuticals, is what will tariffs really look like? And I think it's hard to tell. Certainly, we backed off of the tariff threat to China significantly, but there's still significant tariffs in place. The administration in the last few days has announced going back to 50% tariffs on Europe, and the tariffs are just enormous disruptors for any type of planning, because you have to then dig. You can't look at therapeutic categories, you can't look at industry sectors, because every company is going to have their own cost basis tied to things that are very hard to see, and they're not part of their SEC filings. They've not had to look at supply chain at this level of detail and share that with investors. And I think many of these companies themselves don't know how exposed they are to tariffs. So I'd say the hardest thing as an investor right now is, what are the impact of tariffs on the industry? I think as an investor, I'm currently avoiding therapeutic categories with new science. And particularly biotech. The new FDA leadership for vaccines and biotech products is very skeptical of industry, and I expect that to slow approvals. I think line extensions of approved therapeutics look the most promising for an investor, because it's going to be hard to get new things approved. So there's an opportunity to take old things and dress them up slightly differently. The science is there, the safety data is there. I still think that US and EU companies, for the long term, those that are best positioned for an aging population, that's nothing new, but I think that will remain true through this period. I think devices, if a device company can avoid the tariff threat in terms of really hurting their business, I think devices will have an easier time with approvals. There'll be less skepticism. They're not seen as the same level of mysterious science. It's a 3D object, and people, I think, just culturally are more comfortable with an object than what's in that pill. Um, I am also interested in companies that are looking at AI and how to use artificial intelligence to better target therapies, better run healthcare systems. Uh, that, first of all, AI in the healthcare space will be unregulated. In the House bill, there is a 10-year moratorium on any regulation of the AI industry. So the AI companies that are venturing into health, to me, look particularly interesting. Um, I think U.S. insurance companies I'm avoiding for now because of the Medicaid cuts, and they're getting squeezed by the large hospital systems and now the government. So they're not in a good position. Um, and I would take, if you took the long view, I think EU companies that capitalize on the brain drain from top U.S. centers, I think it's something if you're willing to hold and invest for the long term, that they look, I think, more promising. There have always been great companies, but I think that they will do well from this environment over time. And I think the Chinese biopharmaceutical industry is rapidly catching up with the US and Europe. And it's very difficult to find access to those companies as an investor. And there's some a lot of risks as an investor outside China. But I think if you can find a way to benefit from Chinese growth in this area, and I'd say the last investment advice is if you're going to read the news about this every day, take two aspirins.
With this accent, I would like to thank you, Steve, for a deep, analysis of the current healthcare situation in the US. As you said, the situation is extremely dynamic, and our conference is going to happen in a week time. So in this week time, we might see new developments. Huh? But anyway, I wish you a nice day. Thank you very much for your time,
Sure.
for preparation, for our discussion, and thank you.
Great to see you.